Good morning. Welcome back to session 2. We have some important topics to discuss for the next hour or so, and we'll give you a chance to weigh in on those topics as well. We have with us today Chris Farrell on my far right, who's an economics commentator for Marketplace Money and for Minnesota Public Radio. He studied history at Stanford, sociology at the London School of Economics, and has made his professional life writing about economics topics from retirement to disinflation to managing your money. I would say it's a pretty distinguished liberal arts experience in Chris's life. So he's a living, breathing example of how one can land on one's feet with a liberal arts degree from someplace out on the West Coast. Congratulations on that. On my immediate right is my colleague, John McGee, who's a vice president for planning and public affairs at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. John has the distinct pleasure of reporting to 2 presidents. You can ask him about how much fun that is sometime when you can grab him at a break. John is a St. John's University graduate, and he has a master's degree from the University of Minnesota as well. We set out a little task for the 2 of them as we set up this panel to talk about the value proposition of higher education. And if they do their job correctly, those of you that deal with budgets for fiscal year 18 will have nothing to worry about. You will have so much new revenue and so much money from cost savings, you won't know what to do with it. Chris, if you'd like to start with that challenge.
We're going to go now.
Yeah. Value proposition. Okay. You can tell me about the value proposition later on. Well, thank you very much. I'm really honored to be here. And what I want to do is make some remarks about the intersection of the overall economy, family finances, and college, and kind of set a tone about the overall economic environment for the liberal arts education. But just a note of caution on this about some of the prognostications that I might be making. So there's a job opening, and the Human Resources Department calls in a person, a mathematician, applies for the job, and the human resources person says, what's 2 plus 2? Mathematician says 4. And he goes, are you sure? Mathematician gets irritated, but says, yes, I'm sure. Calls in the next person, it's an accountant, asks the same question, what's 2 plus 2? Accountant says, 4, give or take 10%. Calls in an economist, good interviewer, what's 2 plus 2? Economist gets up, closes the blinds, puts a chair right next to the interviewer and says, what do you want it to equal? I'm going to try to do a little bit better than that. But first, what I want to say is I think when it comes to thinking about college, since we're talking about college here, is that the unmistakable message of all the turmoil that we've gone through over the past decade is that a college education, post-secondary education, is more valuable than ever before. You know, to paraphrase the philosophers, it's the necessary but not sufficient condition to have the kind of opportunity to have a career and jobs that offer a decent income, that come with benefits, and that can be stimulating over a long period of time. Now, there's, as Andrew DeBanco mentioned last night, there has been this commentary, is a college education worth it? Usually written by people who have 2 degrees from Stanford University or Columbia University, maybe Harvard. And I think that really parents and students have said, yes, you can come up with Bill Gates or the late Steve Jobs or Mark Zuckerberg, but basically, yes, a college education is worth it. And if you look at the recovery, the 12 million jobs that have been created during the recovery, 73% of the jobs went to people with a bachelor's degree or higher. And so I think that's really clear evidence. And also, since this conference is talking about a liberal arts education, one of the things I've been noticing recently, and it's anecdotal, and I'm a journalist, so you get 3 anecdotes, that equals a story. So you have in the Atlantic, you have in the Harvard Business Review, and another publication, people in the technology industry reevaluating the value of a classic liberal arts education. And David Kalt was the last one that I read, serial entrepreneur, and he was looking back over his career. And he said, I always really believed the only thing that had value was the technology education. And now what I'm really realizing is the best team members in all the companies that I created had a liberal arts education. And it was the value of critical thinking is what he was highlighting. And so I think we are going through a period of time. College is increasingly valuable. People realize that it's increasingly valuable. And then, of course, you always get to the issue of what's it going to cost? And you all know the numbers better than I do. If you go to 1984-85 to 2014, 2015, private college tuition, fees, room and board up 120%. In terms of student borrowing, you had a 92% increase in the number of students who were borrowing, and the average student loan went up by about 74%. And that's where you get to that number, that $1.3 trillion in student loan debt that everyone talks about. And we do have a system that I think does rely too much on student loan debt, although not everyone has borrowed $150,000 for their undergraduate degree. But what I think is the real key issue is the trend in family finances. And I think that family finances have stagnated for a long period of time. And this is not a temporary trend. This is a long-term trend. So just to look at the recent period that we've been going through and rounding the numbers up, if you look at median household income in 2000, rounding it up, it was $58,000. Median household income in 2014 was $54,000. If you look at wages, for the bottom 60% of the wage spectrum, wages were down over the same period of time for that group. And then you look at your college graduates from 2000 till now. Wages have stagnated. In 2000, for 21 to 24-year-olds, average hourly earnings was about $18.40. It's now about $18.40, adjusted for inflation. So this is really the story that we're living with. It's about stagnating income. And we've also gone through a period of time where people have been unemployed, they've been underemployed, maybe they lost their home, maybe they're afraid of losing their home. I mean, it's been a period of time of great economic fear and uncertainty. And so the sense that people aren't getting a big wage increase, they're not. Now, the economy is not as bad as you would think it would be, right? It's been growing at a 2% average annual rate. That's not great, but it has been growing. You have 69 straight months of employment growth. That's a record since we've been keeping records since 1939. The unemployment rate's at 4.9%. But nonetheless, the wage increases are not there. And then if you take a step back from 1979 to 2012, outside of a period from 1995 to 2000, basically wage growth has been muted. So the median worker, which I think is increasingly important, that median worker and that median household, increasingly important to the future college students who are going to be going to college, had a 5% increase in their wages over that period of time. And I actually think the situation is worse than these numbers. And the reason why the situation is worse is a fundamental shift in the labor market. 40% of the workforce, according to the Government Accountability Office, is now contingent. And that's up from 31% in 2005. And your contingent worker is the freelancer, the independent contractor, the gig economy Uber driver. And this is a bigger part of our economy. This part of our economy, they don't get employer-sponsored retirement savings plan at work. They don't get employer-sponsored health insurance plan at work, although that has improved with Obamacare. There actually is a genuine choice there. They don't have a lot of the protections in terms of unemployment insurance, minimum wage, overtime laws. And so it's really an existence, even when people make decent money, it's an existence of financial insecurity. And then if you think about this period from 1979 till now, about what has been happening in corporate America, it has been a drive for efficiency. It's been a drive toward restructuring, downsizing, right-sizing. What's your favorite euphemism? Handing out pink slips. And so the workers who are still on the full-time payroll feel that the difference between them and a contingent worker is a matter of degree, not a matter of kind. And so it becomes difficult to plan. The more and more workers you have that are contingent, it becomes more and more difficult to do long-term planning, saving for retirement, saving for your children's college education. That bill becomes harder to do. You do fairly well, actually, on a day-by-day basis, but not in terms of the planning. The other thing that is affecting a lot of families, just in case you were wondering, the baby boom generation is getting older, and there's just this national conversation we've been having about the need to save more for retirement. And the Federal Reserve's latest data, in their survey, 50% of the households they surveyed had no retirement savings. Of the ones who did have retirement savings, it was $120,000 was the median. So if you buy an inflation-adjusted annuity, that's going to give you $310 a month. So there is enormous pressure to save more for your retirement, and that is a good thing. Saving for retirement is a good thing. Sending your kids to college is a good thing. But there is this incredible pressure to be doing both. And because of this lack of wage increases, the other thing that came out of that Federal Reserve data that I found really interesting is 47% of the households that they surveyed could not come up with $400 in an emergency. They would have to put it on their credit card, which is what most of them would do, or they would have to sell some sort of asset to meet the bill. And then if you think about households, what came out of the Great Recession, the Great Credit Crunch, the bursting of the housing bubble? There was a period of time, this income inequality trend has been going on for a long period of time, but it was kind of masked for a while there by the bubble. And if you look at 2002 to 2006, a friend of mine, economist Michael Mandel, did this calculation. And if you look at households that own their own home, with home equity loans, what they were doing was giving themselves the equivalent of a 3% raise a year. Now that's gone. And households have really done an amazing job, some of it forced, some of it volunteer, in terms of restoring their household balance sheet. And the household balance sheet is a lot safer right now than it was. But we're not kind of seeing the savings rate we'd like to see. But again, I think that's because not getting any wage increases. But the debt, and a lot of it was forced, but the debt levels are down. But households are fundamentally conservative, and they're going to be increasingly conservative. And as you go down the income spectrum, rightfully so, households become more and more conservative in terms of borrowing. And now if you just think about your situations, the people you know, your children, and thinking about wage increases, when do you think people are just going to walk into their boss's office and say, hey, give me a 10% raise or I'm leaving? They're going to say leave, even despite 69 straight months of improvements in the employment rate. So I think we're living in an economy where family finances are under strain. It's hard to see where there's going to be much growth. There's a possibility if we get some productivity improvements down the road, but productivity is running, that number that economists love about doing more with less. Productivity is running at a level about 1.3% since 2005. It was 2.8% the previous decade. If the productivity rate had continued at the 2.8% rate, we'd be $2.7 trillion richer in 2015, which is about $8,400 per American. And so it's hard to see in the environment that we're in where family incomes are going to improve, particularly once you're down to the 70% and below in the income spectrum. So I think families are going to stay conservative with their borrowing. I think they're going to continue to try to save for their retirement and for emergencies, but it's going to be a real struggle because corporate America is not providing wage increases. John? See, I like setting it up for him. Now,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. I'm going to start with a song. And by the way, I'm the only person up here who knows this. You don't put a 5'5" guy behind a 6'5" podium who's up here with two people taller than 6 feet as it is, so I need to be height appropriate. I'm going to start with a song. I'm not going to sing the song, however. Honest to God, I did a rap in this room 8 weeks ago. It was torturously bad. It made the point, but it was awful. But this isn't, and I think this could describe us. It's a Billy Joel song. It's called Summer Highland Falls, and it goes like this. They say that these are not the best of times, but they're the only times I've ever known. And I believe there is a place for a time for meditation in cathedrals of our own. I see that sad surrender in my lover's eyes. I can only stand apart and sympathize, for we are always what our situation hands us. It's either sadness or euphoria. And I think that's it. And if you didn't like that, just stick with Guns N' Roses' Welcome to the Jungle, because that's what we've got. There's your liberal arts references for the day, Billy Joel and Guns N' Roses. Chris and I have done this together now at least a half a dozen times. We scare people. We try to scare people a lot, and it works. And we could apologize to taking you from 0 to Xanax in less than 20 minutes, but that really would miss the point of what it is we're trying to do here, that economics actually matter a lot. And we need to be keenly aware of the economic pressures and opportunities of our own particular context and circumstance. Neither Chris or I have the answers for any college in this room, not one, because context matters a lot. Context is really everything. I have the privilege of serving on 2 cabinets at the same time. But we have to make real decisions in real time. So economics, in fact, are not an abstraction. And if it's true that you cannot cut your way to heaven in the face of these challenges, it is equally true that you can spend your way to hell if you ignore them. So keep that in mind as you consider these kinds of choices. They're not easy. They're incredibly messy choices. And in 2008, demographic and economic trends collided in a very particular way that significantly altered the trajectory of the higher education marketplace. And I usually start with this. I have 3 siblings. I have 3 brothers. I'm the oldest. I enrolled in college as a first-year student in fall at St. John's in fall 1980. My youngest brother finished college in the spring of 1989. Over that 9-year period, my parents faced, before financial aid, total cost of attendance of about $100,000 for all 4 of us for 9 years. 3 went to private institutions, 1 to a public university. We needed financial aid to be able to attend. Coincidentally, I have 4 children. We're Catholic. I have 4 children. They are ages 11, 15, 16, and 19, which absolutely proves we're Catholic. We did not space them far enough apart in age to get out from the burden of what this is all going to cost. But as I was writing a book that I wrote last year, as I was noodling about this, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, and I turned to my wife and I told her the 100,000 statistic for my brothers and I said to her, you know, if our 4 kids make the same choices of institutions, you and I will face costs 8.5 to 9.5 times higher than my parents did. And she looked at me like I was the stupidest person in the planet for having told her that, and asked, why did you tell me that? And I said, this is what I do for a living. And I thought, really, you ought to know. And then she went back to doing whatever it is she was doing. But it turns out that's one generation. One generation. And that scares people a lot. And it should scare them a lot. And frankly, it should also scare us. The collision of demography and economics makes the fear more acute. And the acuteness of the fear has influenced and reshaped perceptions about the value and purpose of higher education and college, often in ways, I think, that are particularly damaging to the liberal arts and to liberal arts colleges. Now, I want to amplify a few of the economic issues that Chris raised because I think they're worth restating. Since 2000, in constant dollars, first of all, let me ask you this. How many people here in this room could recite with any degree of accuracy the all-in cost of attendance at your institution? And by that I mean tuition, fees, room, board, and allowable expenses, which include books and travel and sort of walk-around money. Because, by the way, this is what the financial aid uses, and this is what a family really experiences. How many of you think you could do that accurately? Well, I'm glad there's a couple of hands anyway. It's a hard question. I think most people don't know. We spend a lot of time fussing about the rate of tuition, a lot less time thinking about room and board, and no time at all thinking about the other costs that students and families actually face. But if we look at just tuition fees, room and board in constant dollars at private colleges, the cost of attendance has risen by 43% since 2000 and by 68% at public 4-year colleges. Now, the net price of attendance after financial aid has gone up by a lot less at private colleges, by 24%, but by 60% at public colleges. Now, that's an oft-told and ought to be well-understood story. But the rest of the story, Paul Harvey's dead, but still, that's a good line. The rest of the story is still important. Since 2000, Chris pointed to real household income. I look at real family income and the incomes of families with children, because that's our pipeline. And so since 2000, real median family income of families with children has fallen by 9%. and is now equal, coincidentally, to the purchasing power it had in 1997, which is when the students we will enroll this fall as new entering students were born, which is an odd coincidence, but a telling one at that. Over a very long period of time, income gaps, as Chris said, have widened, but the gaps have accelerated since the recession. Among those in the bottom 20% of the US population, real mean family income has fallen by 12% since 2007. It's fallen by 7% for the fourth quintile, by 5% for the third quintile. Oh, by the way, the people in the top 5%, the top 20%, they're doing okay. They always do okay. This has enormous consequences for us. It has to do with a changing population. It has to do with increasing concentration of wealth. So I decided I'd look at that data for College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. Since the recession, since 2007, the median family income for our top quintile of students has gone up by 10%. They are wealthier. Now, more of those students are also applying for financial aid than did then as well. But the median family income for the bottom quintile, who have always applied for financial aid, has fallen at St. Ben's and St. John's by 40%. Independent, of course, of the change in price. So the financial aid requirements for those students, for 20% of our student body, are extraordinary, independent of whether we had changed the price by $1 or not. This has extraordinary consequences for access, for those students, and frankly for us, because there are two questions that every college needs to ask. Who can afford my college, and whom can my college afford? And you have to answer those questions at the same time. I want to pivot to savings because it's really bad. America is a nation of hopers and not savers. We like to say we're going to save, and then we use a credit card to buy gum. Almost half of all people use their credit cards, don't pay their balances, their full balance every month. Only 4 in 10 American families say they save by choice. 1 in 10 say they save by accident, meaning there's money left at the end of the month, and they didn't know it was going to be there, and they put it away. The personal savings rate is now around 5.5%, which is considerably lower than historic averages. But Sally May's research in this, in their report, How America Pays or Saves for College, which is really quite fine. They do it every year. Their last report, so you put these numbers together, here's what you come up with. Only 8% of all families with children under age 18 say they save for college and have a goal for saving and are very confident that they'll reach that goal. Ouch. That's a wipeout. That's a wipeout for us. You can put all of your students in one of 3 boxes. They'll all fit there. The first is the clearly needy. The clearly needy are those for whom the price of attendance before financial aid is equal to half or more of their income. So now, think about your total price of attendance, multiply it times 2. Every student below that threshold fits that definition. That's about 70% of the students at St. Ben's and St. John's. It's about 2/3 of all students at private colleges nationally. That would be 2/3 of the population would fit that definition. And it's not synonymous with low income because those incomes would go up into the hundreds of thousands. These are the clearly needy. Then there's the clearly wealthy, the most overhunted, overstocked group of students in America. These are students for whom the price of attendance doesn't matter, but we harbor the belief that they're willing to pay it. That if we just say, look, I'd love to give you a merit award, that in fact they will say, oh, please, don't do that. I'm not interested in your money. Keep it for yourself. I'm sure you have better ways of spending it. High ability to pay is not synonymous with high willingness to pay. But if you just cut it at about $200,000 in family income, which is increasingly too low, that's less than 8% of all American families with children under age 18. So it's not very many families. Then there's the grade in between, the ambiguously needy or wealthy. These are people who shop at Target. And we know this in Minnesota, at Minnesota institutions, because we always have Target execs on our boards at Minnesota institutions. And they tell us this, I've talked to them about this, that the median customer, the typical customer at Target has an income between about $70,000 and $170,000 in income. These are upper middle class people. They always define themselves as the middle class, even though by sort of strict statistics, they're not. But nonetheless, they're upper middle class. And for them, the signature emotion is fear. They're too rich to be poor and too poor to be rich, and the financial aid formulas that exist tax their income at very steep rates as they go up. And so they have high expectations for their kids and for college, but they absolutely do not have the means to pay for it. I want to pivot now to the changing population. The young population, I'm talking here about the traditional age population, in the US is rapidly becoming more racially, ethnically, and culturally diverse. Between 2005 and 2015, the number of high school graduates of color in the United States rose by 29%. The number of white high school graduates fell by 8%. Between 2015 and 2025, the number of graduates of color in the United States will rise by about 24%. The number of white high school graduates will fall by an additional 5%. Young people of color today make up 46% of all Americans under age 18 and half of all elementary and secondary school children in America, compared to just 28% of all Americans aged 45 to 64, which is probably one of the reasons why this room looks like it looks. This has, the change in demography presents an extraordinary opportunity for us, but it is not economically benign in any way at all. There are significant differences in family income by race and ethnicity that influence opportunity both for those students and for colleges themselves. The median incomes for white and Asian families with children aged 6 to 17 are double what they are for Black and Hispanic families, similar Black and Hispanic families. Black and Hispanic families are twice as likely to be Pell Grant eligible as white or Asian students, and much less likely to come from high-income families. So to put this in really stark relief, at the College of St. Benedict this last fall, the median family income for new entering white students was $120,000. The median family income for new entering students of color, who collectively comprised 23% of our entering class, was $45,000. That's a gap of epic proportion. That is not simply a financial aid issue. That's way beyond a financial aid issue. It suggests differential access to opportunity on campus. What does it mean about getting an internship if you have to go someplace and have a car to go there? What does it mean to be able to study abroad? Do you have that opportunity if you come from a family with an income like that? We need to think about that and prepare for that. That's not something we can just say, uh-oh, this has happened. This is a question you need to wrestle with. The upshot of all this is that the effort required of families and colleges to enroll, retain, and complete has increased significantly. Why? Okay, how many CFOs are here? I know ours. Okay, I have never met a CFO who didn't ask the question, why do we spend so much money on financial aid? And the answer is really simple, because it costs a lot. It costs a real lot for most families. A real lot. That's the technical way of putting it, the highly educated way of putting it. I'm on a bowling team. It works for them. And college is increasingly expensive. We bend price curves like pretzels at our institutions. Last fall at St. John's University, we enrolled 1,716 students who paid 993 different prices after scholarship and grant aid from all sources. And by the way, it's the same at all your institutions. Just the numbers are different, but the sort of ratios, the fact that we spend a lot of time talking about the discount rate, no such thing. Is there one price at which we find ruin? No, there's not. There's hundreds. And so we need to be on top of this. None of this would matter, of course, if we were less subject to the winds of the marketplace or wholly financially secure or independent, but alas, we're not. Half of all liberal arts colleges in the country derive at least 60% of their operating income from net tuition. The median endowment per student at the more than 200 liberal arts colleges who reported endowment in 2014 was less than $90,000 per student. You're not going to get rich on that. Most colleges will have to stake their claim on value and deliver their experience in an unrelentingly unforgiving economic environment. Now, having said all of that, as Chris noted, if the cost of going to college is high, the cost of not going to college is much, much higher, almost measured across almost any statistic. And in less than 50 years, without any conversation at all, college has displaced high school as the threshold experience for some kind of prospect of economic independence and success. This is an extraordinary loss for secondary education, by the way, but an extraordinary gain for us, right? But that gain for us comes at a price too, because it's a game changer. People view a product, price, or service differently when it becomes a necessity than when it's a luxury. Their expectations are higher. They will often turn to public policy outlets to seek redress for the issues that they think somebody has put up a barrier for me to have this experience that I absolutely have to have or I won't succeed. So the stakes associated with going to college are higher than ever before for them and consequently for us. And so I think that extraordinary pressure to reduce or more effectively manage both the price and cost of college will define the foreseeable future, and no amount of wishful thinking about economic growth and a return to halcyon days gone by is going to change that basic reality for most institutions. How much should a quality liberal arts education cost? How should it be priced? Are the relationships between price, cost, and value clear, or even partly clear? And the answers to those questions can't be more or less and I don't know, because that's not helpful. Revenue is finite. It's always finite. Demand for spending is almost always infinite, on the other hand. So in that context, how are we going to allocate scarce resources to derive the greatest outcome possible, however we derive outcome? And by the way, it doesn't matter. If I have $10,000 a student or $20,000 a student, I am obligated to deliver value up to the resources that I have. You don't get a pass because you have more or less. You still have to deliver for something. And how can we strike a working balance between the constraints and aspirations in support of the highest quality learning experience we can provide for our students? This is the imperative of leadership. This is what we get to do. I actually think, Chris and I get paid to make people sad, I guess. But if that's the way to respond to this, is nothing more than a lament, we've missed the point. We've got to act. This is the point, is to figure it out for our institutions. We can't wish them away, and we need to take them on in the best interests of our students and our mission, and we need to do it with all due speed and dispatch. That's what I have. Thank you. Well, we're going to take questions now. Right?
You can imagine John's a lot of fun in cabinet meetings. We'll open it up in just a second, but I want to press Chris and John to do something more than be pessimistic, which they did quite admirably. Thank you, gentlemen. So what do we do with this? I mean, you've told us things that I think a lot of people in this room are pretty cognizant of. We have to do something about the price and cost structure of higher education. Any suggestions? That's what I thought.
Okay. Was this for our next cabinet meeting? Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
I don't have actual suggestions for what, as far as answers go, but I think I'll throw a series of questions that I think you need to ask on campus as it relates to spending, because I think we can do better. And by the way, let me preface that by saying this. The language of crisis is grossly overused, really badly overused. It was badly overused during the recession, that a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. What a dumb sentiment. It's not helpful in any way, because it says, among other things, that if the crisis missed me, I am so awesome that it just missed me, when in fact I might just have been lucky. In fact, that's why I think disruption is more nuanced and important. And most institutions aren't in crisis. And so I was actually speaking at a college last fall, and a faculty member speaking to the faculty of the college, and they said, well, what do we do? And I said, well, don't walk to the abyss, which is trite, but also true. And so I think you ask a series of questions. Why do we do things this way? Which is a way better question than starting with, we got to cut this. Why do we do things this way? What level of quality or service or experience can we provide, really, within the resources we have available? Be honest with yourself about that. Understand that when you answer, by the way, just those two questions, you're not going to make everybody happy. You're going to make a lot of people really sad. And the problem in higher education is there's a Horton, here's a who kind of way for every choice. A change is a change, no matter how small. Because the people impacted by the change, to them, it's a big deal. We took Nordic skiing at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University from a varsity sport to a club sport. About 28 skiers. You would have thought the world crashed around us when we did that. We got letters from skiers all over the globe telling us, it went viral, telling us how awful this was, who had never heard of us either. What we did with the resources was reallocate them to club sports, which were going to serve more students. We actually didn't cut the money, we reallocated it. All of those students ended up staying, but there was a lot of Sturm and Drang for a while. And even a change like that, which most people would define as relatively small, was not for the people impacted. So understand, you're not going to make everybody happy. What spending choices do we have that we define as non-negotiable in relation to our values or our mission?
Let me suggest one.
Okay?
So this is a room filled with individuals that work at liberal arts institutions where what we offer students is a high-touch, high-contact environment with faculty. So 25 students in a classroom with one faculty member. How do we get around that economics and still provide what we provide, or can't we?
I don't think, well, do you want to answer this?
This one I can't do. I can do the previous one. I can do the other
All right,
one.
let me
thought
just,
on the other one.
I don't think we can escape the economics of that. I mean, I think the hard part is it's very difficult for us to know what an incremental change creates in terms of a consequential outcome. So changing, for example, your student to faculty ratio a half a point or a point it's difficult to know, or your student to staff ratio, how that's going to, what kind of immediate change that's going to produce. That said, that's not a suggestion that we can avoid the question, because we can't. And so that's one of the reasons, by the way, I think this is a time we have to actually behave like a collegium, that administration, faculty, and staff need to be talking to each other about this, not across each other about this.
So just on your earlier question, this is really the perspective of an outsider. And I think off of one of the things John was saying is to take very seriously a sense in the United States that the system is rigged. There is a fundamental belief that the system is rigged. And there is a strong belief that college is rigged. And the reason why is, what is the price of going to college? What is it? Now, nobody can tell me this. And then you say, well, it's posted on your website at $50,000. Well, no one pays $50,000. Okay, so how much is it? How much is it? It's like going back to an automobile lot in the 1970s. What's the real price of this car? Well, if you got somebody, a relative who really knows cars and understands cars and knows the business, they're going to negotiate a good deal. And then you read in the paper about people are hiring consultants to negotiate deals. And have you really tried to do that FASB thing? I mean, FAFSA. Sorry. I was thinking about standard boards there. It's like, okay, what is the price? And I think there is a fundamental suspicion that the system is rigged in favor of certain students and certain parents, and other people are being taken advantage of. And I think that is at its core one of the big challenges that liberal arts colleges face, is that people increasingly feel, well, they're wealthy, they're going to get in. My kid's not. And I am stunned at the number of young people that I meet, because I talk to a lot of high schools, you talk to probably many more, but who will be first generation going to college, that will never even apply to a liberal arts college because it's way too expensive. And then I say, well, it's not. They say, well, how much does it cost? I can't tell them. I can say, well, probably for you, it's probably going to cost very little. But we don't know that. And I think that this discounting and the continuing of discounting and 992 or 1,000 different prices, that this has created a monster that is feeding a suspicion that the liberal arts system is rigged against the average family. And families, I think, more and more believe that. And that's a fundamental problem. And that's in your control.
Sort of. Depends what your competitors are doing. So, questions from you all? Comments, questions, observations?
Answers? Scott.
Hi, I'm Scott Jassick with Inside Higher Ed, and so just listening to the last two comments, why not kill so-called merit aid, really non-need-based aid? Then, per the point that nobody knows what college costs, you would know what it costs, and you would pay for however many low-income students you could afford, and you could be honest about it. I think when you're talking about the sense that college aid is rigged, it's really, if you talk to more and more people, they're convinced that not only that rich people get in, but that rich people will get aid. And that so that would be my question. Wouldn't you solve some of these problems? And I just looked on the St. Benedict's website, and you've got a lot of cool
scholarships that don't seem to require one being needy?
Well, most of our, and this would be true at most, certainly most private institutions, most of the merit aid awarded to students goes to students who demonstrate need, because at least here, about 85% of our students demonstrate need. I think, Scott, part of a number of responses to that, the conversation about merit versus need-based aid has an inside baseball lingo to it that from the vantage point of a family is you can go on all you want about merit and need. I'm telling you, I need this to enroll at your institution. And I think my point about willingness to pay is the great problem associated with this. We clearly have an interest in meeting the needs of the lowest income students who apply to and want to enroll at our institutions. Got that, and I think we work really hard to do that. But I recognize that for a family who fills out a FAFSA, a family of 4 with 1 in college that becomes a full-pay student by virtue of the formula, which, by the way, was not brought down by Moses, though we treat it that way, that family is judged to be a full-pay family on a $53,000 experience is probably not very realistic. We have to think about that in the context of the demand that we have for our institutions. Stanford has 45,000 applications for admission, of whom they admit fewer than 3,000, and an 83% yield rate on those they admit. It's a lovely deal. I don't have that. And actually,
The number of schools in the country that have that are probably 50.
Less than that, probably.
I'm being
And
generous.
so I have to, we have to play in a different way. I think, if we were talking about in a perfect world, I'd love to do exactly what you're suggesting. The problem is the formula, our imperfect formula developed by imperfect people to manage imperfect data.
Well, and it's not just that. I mean, speaking as a college president, let me interject myself into your panel, sorry. Demographics make that virtually impossible. If we did that, our class size would fall by half probably. So every school like us, the schools that are out here that we compete with, are tuition driven, and they're looking to bring in revenue from students, whether it's students that are need-based students or merit students. We simply could not use that formula and simply say, here's our price based on our costs, here's the financial aid award that you get based on your family's income. We would go out of business almost immediately. And I suspect that's true for everyone else in this room.
Thank you for some very insightful and, as always, delightful presentation of what can be rather dry information from both of your accounts, all 3 of your accounts. My question is to take sort of the opposite side of this, and I'd like to hear you deconstruct a little bit more what's driving the costs in these institutions of higher education around the country. For example, my impression, and I don't have statistics behind me, unfortunately, is that there's been quite a dramatic difference in increase in size of staff at most colleges and universities compared to size of faculty. That faculty haven't grown significantly, but staff has. Since I came to St. Ben St. John's, for example, also in terms of costs, the increase in facilities has generally been student service facilities in the last 25 years and not academic buildings, for example. So what are some of the pressures that are driving these governmental, structural, market tastes, demands, and so on? If you comment on that, I think that would be appreciated.
That's John Hasselberg. He's on our faculty. I think over a long period of time, higher education has become more broadly expansive. The experience that you got at Gustavus when you were there is no longer the same experience at Gustavus, any more than the experience that I got at St. John's from 1980 to 1984 is the same. I was one of the first people on campus when I worked in the president's office after graduating at St. John's who got a PC with a giant green monitor that had 64K of memory, and our IT services department had 3 people total. and you could call it IT, I guess. We did. But in addition to that, I think it's quite clear that we've added other services that we didn't dream of a generation ago. Disability services, many of them student support services that are important. Disability services, career advising services, more intense academic advising services, and frankly, some amenities. Though climbing walls, vastly overrated, they're cheap. Lazy rivers, that's a different deal. But climbing walls are cheap. You just turn a racquetball court, put some bumps on it and climb. The athletic people here, I know, I'm sorry about that. But in any case, the experience is more expansive, and I think the idea that students will come to college to have an aesthetic experience at the feet of the masters is not true anywhere. That's part of it. The other piece of it is, and Robert Archibald is in the room somewhere, and he's going to talk to us tomorrow, is going to do, and his book, Why Does College Cost So Much, with David Feldman, is really quite fine. That's my plug for you today. It's out in the lobby for sale. It's really quite fine. This is a people-driven industry as well. 70% or so, and if you add in student employees, which were a big part of the workforce at many institutions, it's higher. At least 70 cents on the dollar that we spend is on people. And so we're delivering a service to people. I also think we don't have good standards for understanding what efficiency is. Howard Bowen got it right in the revenue theory of cost, which posits that raise as much as you can, spend as much as you raise. And in fact, every ranking system rewards schools that have more because they can spend more independent of their outcomes.
And just one, I agree there, just one thing to add. It seems that no matter what, every institution will always charge what the market can bear. And, you know, there's a lot of demand to go to college. And employers are still rewarding people who have a college degree. And so you're raising the price over a period of time, offering more services, offering a better deal in terms of the overall experience, but the demand is there. And therefore, even with protestations about cutting costs, if you can raise your price, oftentimes you will.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. So the key question is, given the demographic imperative that you have articulated, is the current economic model of liberal arts colleges sustainable? So that's the question. Let me just connect a couple of dots. Professor DiBanco last night talked about the necessity of a diverse student body to really carry out these critical conversations. And then Mr. McGee, you just gave us the numbers here about the difference between those that have got means and those that are first generation. Given that this number of first generation students and those with low means in the next 10 years are going to surpass the other group, right? Are most colleges simply going to close? Or is there something else we should be thinking about?
We should be thinking about something besides closing. Let me start with that one. I know I don't, I take a different perspective than many people, and this was in an interview I had with Inside Higher Education, and I said, I don't think most colleges are going to close because I think we're clever, and we'll figure out ways not to for a long time. So I actually don't see a wave of closing, and I don't think we have to. Having said that, you asked the question of whether the changing demography is the liberal arts model sustainable? I'd answer that in two ways. First of all, I think it's more important than ever. I think it's important that first generation students and students who've not historically had access to this kind of education have access to this kind of education. Otherwise, we're going to land in a place where we're already in danger of landing, which is that people with the most extraordinary means who always get the best deal, they get to have these incredible experiences and nobody else does. And you're right, Chris, that the people who talk about the rack and ruin of higher education and question whether it's worth it are always the people with multiple degrees who are talking about somebody else's kids and not their own. It will, however, absolutely test the limits of the economic model. And it's why I asked the question, or the question I tried to frame about what, in the context of your mission or values, is non-negotiable. You got to know that as you enter this conversation. And what is non-negotiable in relation to your comparative advantage? And by the way, your comparative advantage and your mission and values might not be the same thing. So you got to know that too. But you can't have that conversation about the economic model, if whether it's going to work or not, until you have some working sense of what's negotiable and what's not. Because those kinds of economics are going to test these schools extraordinarily, because they just don't have the endowed resources to take care of those students as well as they'd like. I'm sorry, it's not a complete answer, but you got to start with those questions.
Just one quick comment on that. I think this goes to one of the points Chris made. One of the solutions for institutions is to change the relationship with faculty and to have a lot more contingent faculty than regular tenure track faculty. And that will provide some cushion for a while for a lot of our institutions if we choose to go that route. It may very well change the nature of what we provide our students as well. And so that's one of the questions I think we all need to be wrestling with, is whether having more contingent faculty, non-tenure track faculty, which are lower cost, allows us to be sustainable for longer. Does that still provide the kind of experience we want our students to have? Contingent faculty do a great job, but if you have a faculty member piecing together 2 or 3 jobs across institutions, they just can't devote the time and energy to individual students that a tenure track faculty member can, but they're cheaper, and that's the trade-off that we're struggling with as one of the issues going forward. Other? Go ahead.
I'll piggyback on the colleague's question earlier that on staff, an increase in the staff, that makes sense for providing greater services. But a recent New York Times article, maybe April, talked about the exponential increases in salaries for the administrators. And so I'm wondering, how would you respond to a parent? This is not just liberal arts colleges, it's really across all higher ed, but how do you respond to a parent who comes to you and asks, why is the education so expensive when the administrations are receiving these incredible salaries? And or is that just a myth? I mean, do you agree with that premise, or is there some disagreement there?
That depends a lot on the institution that you're at. Look, the football coach at the University of Minnesota gets paid 3 times what anybody gets paid here. It depends a lot at the institution. At most institutions, look, half this room are administrators and likely would not define themselves as, would not be painted with the brush that they're wildly overpaid. In fact, you do have to pay market rates for professionals. The same, by the way, works for faculty as well. That's why we have market baskets. It works for administrators as well. And frankly, most don't get paid in the sensational ways that are often described in mainstream popular media, which is, by the way, the same story with student borrowing. In fact, it's very few students who borrow the extraordinary sums, but it makes a compelling story. I didn't do anything to you.
You're still employed.
I think it depends a lot at the institution that you're at, and I think institutions do the best they can to attract the talent that they need to attract.
But
Faculty
your
and
comment
staff.
is relevant, though. I mean, to link it to John's comment, there has been a growth in administrative staff at these institutions in numbers, and these are professionals, highly educated individuals, and they're expensive. And part of it, I think the simple answer when I talk to parents about this is to say, we're providing an education for students that 30 years ago would not have been at our institutions. We're able to meet the needs of a much wider range of students who have learning disability issues, mental health issues, all kinds of complicated issues that simply would not have been addressed 30 or 40 years ago. And we're willing to pay for that. I mean, as a nation, some of there are some regulations that require some of these things, but I think we've just made a commitment as institutions to make this kind of education available to a wider range of students. And it goes to Chris's point that this is absolutely kind of the entry-level ticket to a middle-class living, and we've decided to pay the resources to help those students get access to that kind of education.
Do we have time for one more? Okay, she's got the microphone in the back, sorry.
what do you see as the effects of the advent of for-profit colleges and universities, both on our institutions, but also on the perceptions of these overstressed families that you've been talking about?
Well, I think part of the difficulty in the whole conversation about student loans, if you really look at the whole student loan issue, you have a for-profit college student loan issue. That's where almost all the problems are really associated. And then you can have a legitimate debate about how much other students should be taking on relative to most of them don't know what they want to be doing, and we rely more on loans, and I think we rely too much on loans. But the core problem is the for-profit student loan issue, and it gets rolled into all colleges. But again, I think that's also serving a different market. It's extremely reliant on the new GI Bill, and so it's heavily marketed. So I don't think it has much of an implication at all, except for the rolling into the sort of this. When we get into a sloppy discussion or a careless discussion about student loan debt, a lot of what is fueling that is the for-profit. But once you break that out, you have a very different discussion about student loan debt.
But I think there's a further question about, is competition from the for-profit sector?
I don't actually see any competition there. There the competition more is on the public sector with the community colleges competing. There are some real issues there in terms of that competition. I don't see it in terms of for this audience.
Was that almost an optimistic note to end on?
So I do want to add one other thing, if I have a chance, just to address your question. This is just a total minor, but it's something that I've been thinking about, which is, Andrew DeBacca was talking about diversity, and your numbers about diversity. And yet we have an incredibly non-diverse campus in one way, which is that most everybody's between 18 and 24. And as we look at the future down the road, the 30 years of the liberal arts education, why don't you have 30-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 50-year-olds, 60-year-olds who are there not just because they never took that class in Italian Renaissance that they wanted to take, but because it's actually part of advancing their career, advancing their knowledge. And I used to be a merchant seaman for 4 years, and you do stare out at the ocean for a long time. But the thing is, you also do learn a lot, and then you go back to school with what you learned. And so I actually think the question for liberal arts colleges to address, you have incredibly loyal alumni. You have an alumni that's living longer. You have an alumni that's working longer. You have an alumni that is going to have multiple careers. Why don't you become their home that they come back to in order to advance their careers when they're 40 and when they're 50 and when they're 60, and then when they die, they're going to leave you a lot of money.
Thank you, Chris and John, for a great discussion. Lots more to talk about.